I never told Peter that I make $85,000 a month because watching people reveal themselves is far more entertaining than watching them pretend. He thought I was some struggling freelance graphic designer working out of a cramped studio in the Tenderloin, living paycheck to paycheck, wearing secondhand cardigans from Crossroads Trading, taking the Muni everywhere like I couldn't afford an Uber. The truth is, I own a cybersecurity firm that I built from scratch after dropping out of Stanford, and my actual apartment is a three-bedroom penthouse in Pacific Heights with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. But Peter had never seen it because I'd been playing this role for 6 months, and I was committed to the performance. Some people collect art or vintage cars, but I collect information about human nature, specifically about how money warps it. And Peter was my latest case study, until his mother slid that envelope across the dinner table at their Presidio Terrace mansion, and everything shifted from an experiment into something personal. The invitation came on a Tuesday. Peter had been hinting at it for weeks, nervous energy crackling off him every time he mentioned his parents, specifically his mother, Caroline, who apparently ran the family's real estate empire with an iron fist wrapped in Hermes silk. "She wants to meet you," he'd said, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup at the Fillmore Street Cafe where we'd met that morning, him thinking I'd walked there from my fake apartment, when really I'd driven my Tesla and parked it 6 blocks away. "I told her about you, about us." There was something in his voice that made me curious, a kind of warning wrapped in hope, like he was both excited and terrified about what would happen when his two worlds collided. I'd smiled at him, played the part of the slightly intimidated girlfriend, touched his hand across the table in that reassuring way that made him think I needed reassuring, when really I was already planning what to wear and how to play it. Saturday evening arrived wrapped in that particular October fog that makes San Francisco feel like it exists between worlds. I dressed carefully in a navy dress from Target that I bought specifically for occasions like this, paired with flats that had seen better days, my hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no jewelry except for the cheap silver studs I'd picked up at a street fair. Peter picked me up in his BMW, which he always seemed slightly apologetic about, like he was embarrassed by his own wealth, and we drove through the Presidio, past those massive homes that look like they were transplanted from European estates, until we reached his parents' place, a sprawling Tudor revival that probably cost $15 million and looked like it came with its own zip code. "Just be yourself," Peter said, as we walked up to the front door, which was hilarious because he had no idea who I actually was, and I squeezed his hand like I was nervous, when really I was calculating, observing, filing away every detail. Caroline Chen Morrison opened the door herself, which surprised me because I'd expected staff, and she was exactly what I'd imagined, mid-50s, immaculately maintained, wearing cream-colored slocks and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hair cut in one of those expensive bobs that look effortless but require weekly maintenance, her smile warm but her eyes doing that quick assessment thing that wealthy people do, taking in my outfit, my shoes, my lack of designer anything, categorizing me in seconds. "Haley, we're so glad you could join us," she said, her voice smooth as aged whiskey, and she pulled me into a hug that felt practiced, the kind of gesture that looks genuine from the outside but holds no real warmth. Peter's father, Douglas, appeared behind her, tall and silver-haired, a retired venture capitalist who now spent his time on non-profit boards and golf courses, and he shook my hand with that firm grip that men like him use to establish dominance, while his eyes slid over me with barely concealed disappointment. The house was a museum of wealth trying to look like a home. We walked through a foyer with marble floors, past a living room with furniture that looked like it belonged behind velvet ropes, into a dining room where the table could have seated 12 but was set for 4, crystal glasses catching the light from a chandelier that probably required its own insurance policy.
Caroline had made dinner herself, she announced, which I suspected was a lie, but I smiled and complimented everything as we sat down, Peter next to me, his parents across from us like judges at a tribunal. The conversation started safe, Douglas asking me about my work, me giving him the rehearsed story about freelancing, how it was tough but rewarding, how I was really passionate about design, all the things that made me sound earnest and struggling and completely non-threatening. Caroline listened with that attentive expression that women like her have perfected, nodding in the right places, asking follow-up questions that sounded interested but were really gathering intelligence. Peter tells us you grew up in the Central Valley, Caroline said as she passed me a bowl of roasted vegetables that probably came from some organic farm in Marin that she knew personally. Modesto, wasn't it? I nodded, which was actually true. That part of my story was real because the best lies are built on foundations of truth. My father had been a mechanic, my mother a teacher's aide, and I had clawed my way out of that town with scholarships and spite. But I didn't mention the Stanford acceptance or the fact that I'd realized halfway through my computer science degree that I could make more money solving problems for companies than I could working for them. It must be quite an adjustment living in the city, she continued, and there was something in her tone that made it clear she didn't mean adjustment in a good way, more like she was acknowledging that I was out of my depth, swimming in waters too deep for someone like me. Dinner progressed through its choreographed stages. Douglas talked about the real estate market, how challenging it was for young people to get started, how important it was to have family support, each comment a subtle dig at my lack of resources, my obvious outsider status. Peter tried to redirect the conversation, talking about his work at the biotech startup where he was a project manager, but his parents kept steering things back to me, to my background, my prospects, my relationship with their son. Peter's had girlfriends before, Caroline said as she cleared the plates, waving away my offer to help, but he's never been this serious about anyone. We just want to make sure he's making good decisions. The implication hung in the air like the fog outside, that I was a bad decision, that I was some gold digger who'd somehow tricked their son into caring about me, that they needed to protect him from making a mistake that would cost him. Then came dessert, some elaborate tart from a French patisserie in Hayes Valley, and after we'd finished and the conversation had reached that awkward lull where everyone's wondering what comes next, Caroline left the room and returned with an envelope. Cream-colored, expensive stationery, the kind you order from places that have been making paper since the 1800s. She placed it on the table in front of me, not casually but deliberately, sliding it across the polished wood surface like she was making an offer in a business negotiation, which I suppose she was. Douglas leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, watching me. Peter looked confused, his gaze darting between his mother and me, not understanding what was happening but sensing it wasn't good. "Haley," Caroline said, her voice gentle but firm, "we think you're a lovely young woman, we really do, but we also think that you and Peter want different things out of life." I didn't touch the envelope. I looked at her, keeping my expression open and confused, playing the part. "I don't understand," I said, even though I understood perfectly. This was the test, the moment they'd probably planned before I'd even arrived, the strategy they'd discussed over their own expensive wine while deciding how to handle their son's unfortunate choice in partners. "Peter is our only child," Douglas said, joining in now, tag-teaming me, "and as such, he's going to inherit considerable wealth, the family business, properties, investments. His mother and I have worked very hard to build what we have, and we need to protect that." Caroline picked up the thread. "We know you care about Peter, and we're sure your feelings are genuine, but we also know that sometimes people from different backgrounds struggle to make relationships work. The stress of financial disparity, different expectations, different life experiences. It all adds up." "There's $25,000 in that envelope," Douglas said, "just putting it out there. No finesse, no subtlety, just the raw transaction. We're prepared to give that to you, along with another $25,000 in 3 months if you break things off with Peter tonight. Clean break, no drama, no contact. You tell him you've realized the relationship isn't working, that you want different things. You walk away, and everyone moves on. I stared at the envelope, at the casual obscenity of it. These people so comfortable with their wealth that they thought they could buy their way out of any problem, that money was the solution to everything, including their son's heart. Peter had gone pale. "What the fuck?" he said, and I'd never heard him swear before, never seen him look at his parents with that mixture of horror and rage. "You're trying to buy off my girlfriend? You're seriously doing this right now?" Caroline reached across the table toward him, her expression pained but determined. "Sweetheart, we're trying to protect you. You're too close to see what we see. This girl, she's nice enough, but she's not from our world. You'll realize that eventually, and it'll end badly, and you'll be hurt and possibly significantly poorer if she decides to make things difficult." She looked at me then, and her eyes were hard despite her soft voice. "We're not saying you're a bad person, Haley. We're saying you're the wrong person, and we're giving you a chance to do the right thing, to walk away with dignity and enough money to get yourself established, maybe go back to school, start over somewhere else. Think of it as us helping you the way we'd help anyone who needed it." I could have ended it right there. I could have told them the truth, pulled out my phone and shown them my bank balance, explained that I probably made more in a month than Douglas had made in the last year of his venture capital career, that I owned property in 3 cities and had a investment portfolio that would make their accountant weep with envy. But that would have been too easy, too quick, and it wouldn't have given me what I actually wanted, which was to understand how far they were willing to go, how deep their contempt ran, what they were really protecting. So instead, I picked up the envelope. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the thickness of the cash inside, and I looked at Caroline with tears in my eyes that I didn't have to fake because I was genuinely angry, not hurt, but furious at the casual cruelty of people who thought their money gave them the right to rearrange other people's lives. "I need to think about it," I said, my voice small and shaky, and I stood up from the table, still holding the envelope, looking at Peter, who was now standing too, his face a mask of betrayal and rage directed at his parents. "I need to go home. I'm sorry, I need to think." I walked toward the door, my cheap flats clicking on the marble floor, and I could hear Peter behind me, arguing with his parents, his voice rising to a shout as Caroline tried to calm him down, and Douglas told him to lower his voice, to think rationally, to understand they were doing this for him. I made it to the front door and out into the fog, down the driveway toward the street, still clutching that envelope like it was a lifeline instead of an insult, and I heard Peter calling after me, but I kept walking, disappearing into the San Francisco night, like the poor, heartbroken girl they thought I was. What Caroline and Douglas didn't know, what Peter didn't know, what nobody knew except me and my accountant, was that I'd been recording the entire evening. Not with my phone, that would have been too obvious, but with a tiny device disguised as a button on my cardigan, something I'd designed myself, actually, because knowing how to exploit security vulnerabilities isn't just about computer systems, it's about understanding how people let their guard down, how they reveal themselves when they think they're dealing with someone powerless. I had every word they'd said, every insult wrapped in concern, every assumption about who I was and what I wanted. And as I walked down the foggy street, past mansions owned by people just like the Morrisons, people who thought their wealth insulated them from consequences, I was already planning what came next. I didn't go to my fake apartment in the Tenderloin because I never actually lived there. I just rented it as a prop, kept a few pieces of furniture in it, used it as a return address. I drove to my real home in Pacific Heights, parked in my private garage, rode the elevator up to my penthouse, poured myself a very expensive glass of wine, and sat by my window looking out at the city lights reflecting off the bay. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from Peter, 30 messages in the first hour alone, and I let them accumulate, reading each one as it came in. His apologies, his rage at his parents, his declarations that he loved me and wanted to make this right, his begging for me to respond. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching. Morrison Properties was the family business, a real estate empire that Caroline had inherited from her father and expanded into one of the most powerful development firms in the Bay Area. They specialized in luxury residential and mixed-use projects, the kind of developments that displaced longtime residents and replaced affordable housing with condos that started at $2 million. Douglas had money from his VC days, but Caroline's family wealth dwarfed his. Old San Francisco money that came from buying up land after the 1906 earthquake and playing the long game for a century. They sat on multiple nonprofit boards, donated to the right causes, showed up at the right galas, had their names on buildings and programs throughout the city. They were, by all public accounts, philanthropic pillars of the community, generous with their wealth, committed to making San Francisco better, which made the private reality of who they actually were even more disgusting. I spent the next 3 days ignoring Peter while I dug deeper. I had access to databases and information networks that most people don't even know exist, the kind of resources you build when your company specializes in finding security vulnerabilities and your clients include some of the most powerful corporations in the world. What I found about the Morrisons was interesting. Not illegal, nothing that would get them arrested, but ethically compromised in ways that would absolutely destroy their carefully cultivated reputation. Morrison Properties had a pattern of buying up buildings in vulnerable neighborhoods, displacing residents through aggressive tactics that skirted the edges of tenant protection laws, then flipping the properties for massive profits while claiming in their marketing materials that they were committed to preserving San Francisco's diverse communities. Caroline sat on the board of a homeless advocacy nonprofit, while her company was directly contributing to the displacement that created homelessness. Douglas advised a startup accelerator focused on helping underserved entrepreneurs, while simultaneously investing in projects that priced those same entrepreneurs out of the city. But the really interesting thing I discovered was a deal that Morrison Properties was currently negotiating, a massive redevelopment project in the Mission District that would require city approval, community support, and the blessing of several key stakeholders who cared deeply about maintaining the neighborhood's cultural character. The project was Caroline's baby, the thing she'd been working on for 3 years, and if it went through, it would cement her legacy as one of the most successful developers in San Francisco history. If it didn't go through, it would be a very public failure that would damage both her reputation and her company's bottom line. The approval process was delicate, requiring navigation of community boards, city supervisors, and a particularly vocal coalition of neighborhood activists who had the power to make Morrison Properties' life very difficult. On the 4th day, I finally responded to Peter. I told him I'd thought about everything, that I wasn't sure what to do, that I needed to see him to talk in person. We met at Dolores Park because I suggested somewhere public and neutral, and he showed up looking like he hadn't slept. His usual polished appearance crumpled at the edges, and he immediately started apologizing for his parents, calling them manipulative and controlling, saying he'd had no idea they were planning that dinner ambush. I told them I don't care about money, he said, sitting on the grass next to me while people flew kites and walked dogs around us. I told them you're not like that we care about each other, but they wouldn't listen. My mom especially, she's always been like this, needing to control everything, needing everyone to fit into her perfect vision. He looked at me with those puppy dog eyes that probably worked on most people. Please don't let them ruin this. Please don't let their money poison what we have. I leaned into him, let him put his arm around me, played the girl who was struggling with a decision instead of the woman who had already made one. Your mom called me yesterday, I said, which was true. She'd left a voicemail asking me to meet her for coffee, wanting to clear the air, which really meant she wanted to make sure I took the money and disappeared. She wants to talk to me. Alone. Peter tensed. You're not going to meet her, are you? I shrugged, looking uncertain. I don't know. Maybe I should hear what she has to say. Maybe there's a way to make this work, to show them I'm not what they think I am. It was the perfect thing to say, because it made me seem willing to fight for the relationship, willing to humble myself in front of his parents, and it made Peter love me even more for being willing to try despite their cruelty. "You're amazing," he said, kissing the top of my head. "You're so much better than they deserve." I met Caroline 2 days later at a cafe in Russian Hill, one of those places where wealthy women meet to discuss charity events and other people's business over $15 lattes. She was waiting when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, looking elegant and composed, and she stood up to greet me like we were friends meeting for a pleasant chat instead of what this actually was. "Haley, thank you for coming," she said, and the gratitude in her voice was so perfectly performed that I almost admired it. "I know the other night was uncomfortable, and I want to apologize for how we handled things. Douglas and we could have been more tactful." She waited until we'd ordered coffee and settled in before continuing. "But our concerns are still valid. You're a sweet girl, and I believe you care about Peter, but you have to understand our position. We've worked very hard to give our son opportunities, and we need to protect him from making decisions that could jeopardize his future." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, looking down at it, the picture of someone uncomfortable but trying to be mature. "I understand you're protective," I said softly. "I'd probably feel the same way if I had a son and thought someone was taking advantage of him." Caroline leaned forward, sensing an opening. "So you understand why we're offering you this opportunity to exit gracefully. 25,000 now, another 25 in 3 months. That's not an insignificant amount of money for someone in your position. You could use it to really build something for yourself, become financially stable in a way that would make you proud." She paused, then added, "Because let's be honest, even if you and Peter stayed together, even if you eventually married, do you really think you'd be happy? Living in our world, constantly aware that you don't quite fit, that people are judging you, that you're always going to be the poor girl who got lucky? That's not a life anyone should want." I let silence stretch between us, let her think she was getting through to me, then I looked up and met her eyes. "What if I could prove that I'm not after Peter's money? What if there was a way to show you that I care about him for who he is, not what he has?" Caroline's expression shifted, became wary but curious. "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, the fake one I'd created specifically for this moment, not showing my real accounts, but a modified version that looked legitimate and showed a balance of around $500. "This is everything I have right now. I'm barely making rent, barely surviving, you're right about that. But what if I signed something? A prenup, or like whatever it's called when you're not married yet. Something that says I won't take Peter's money, that if we break up, I leave with nothing." I watched Caroline's face as she processed this, seeing the calculations happening behind her eyes, and I could almost hear her thinking that this was better than she'd expected, that she was getting what she wanted without even having to pay for it. "That's very mature of you," she said carefully. "But these things are complicated. You'd need a lawyer, Peter would need to be involved, and honestly, I'm not sure that's the best solution." She reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture that was meant to seem compassionate but felt predatory. "The reality is that you and Peter are at different stages in your lives, from different worlds. Even with a prenup, even with the best intentions, those differences are going to create problems. Why set yourselves up for inevitable heartbreak when you could make a clean break now, take the money we're offering, and start fresh? You could even leave San Francisco, go somewhere less expensive, somewhere you might actually be able to build a real life." That was when I knew exactly how to destroy her. Not because she was offering me money, not because she thought I wasn't good enough for her son, but because of how she said it, the casual dismissal of my entire existence as something that only had value if it removed itself from her sight, the assumption that I was so beneath her that I should be grateful for the opportunity to disappear. "You're right," I said, pulling my hand back and standing up. "I should probably leave San Francisco. This city is too expensive for people like me anyway." Caroline stood too, looking relieved and triumphant. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. When you're ready to accept the money, just call me. We'll make it very easy for you." I nodded, picked up my bag, and walked out of the cafe with her thinking she'd won, thinking she'd successfully purchased her son's freedom from an unsuitable relationship, having absolutely no idea what was coming next. But I didn't destroy her the way she expected, didn't expose the recording immediately or confront her publicly about her hypocrisy. Instead, I did something that would take longer but cut deeper, something that would make Caroline Morrison understand exactly what it felt like to be dismissed and discarded by people who thought they knew better. I opened that envelope when I got home, counted the $25,000 in crisp hundreds, and I donated every single cent of it to the Mission District Coalition that was fighting her development project, anonymously, with a note that said the money came from someone who believed in their cause. Then I became Maya Rodriguez full-time for the next 6 weeks, and I built a case against Morrison Properties that was so comprehensive, so devastating, that by the time I was done, Caroline's legacy wasn't just damaged, it was completely rewritten. But that was just the surface, just the public humiliation that everyone would see and talk about. What nobody knew, what I was still holding back as part 1 of this story ended, was that I'd discovered something else during my research into the Morrisons, something that went far deeper than real estate deals and displaced tenants, something that connected Caroline to a network of wealthy San Francisco families who'd been manipulating city politics and development for decades, something that would require me to go even further undercover and take even bigger risks. The envelope wasn't just an insult or a test or even evidence of their character. It was a thread, and when I pulled on it, I discovered it was connected to something much larger, much darker, and much more personal than I ever could have imagined. The Morrisons thought they knew who I was now, thought the Music Center revelation was the end of my revenge, but they had no idea that I'd only just begun to pull apart their world and that when I was finished, everyone in San Francisco would understand exactly what happened when rich people tried to buy their way through life and finally met someone who refused to be purchased.
The thing about destroying powerful people is that you can't just knock down the public facade. You have to dismantle the entire structure they've built to protect themselves. And that takes patience and precision and a willingness to become someone else entirely for as long as it takes to find the cracks in their foundation. 3 months after the community center incident, after Caroline had lost her development deal and resigned from her nonprofit boards and become a cautionary tale in San Francisco social circles, I should have been satisfied, but I wasn't. Because during those months of research, I'd found something that made me realize the Morrisons weren't just another wealthy family using their money to control their son's life. They were part of something systemic, something that had been hurting people for decades. And if I walked away now, I'd only cut off one head of a hydra that would just grow back. It started with a name I found buried in Morrison Properties' corporate filings, a shell company called Pacific Heritage Holdings that owned a significant stake in several of Caroline's development projects, but had no obvious connection to the Morrison family or any known investors. I traced Pacific Heritage through layers of incorporation, following the money through offshore accounts and trust structures, the kind of setup that's technically legal, but designed specifically to hide who actually benefits from the deals. What I found was a network of 12 families, old San Francisco money, people whose names were on museums and hospitals and university buildings, who'd been coordinating their real estate investments for 40 years, buying up properties in neighborhoods they knew the city was planning to develop, then lobbying for those developments, then profiting massively when property values exploded, all while claiming they were committed to affordable housing and economic diversity. The Morrisons were just one node in this network, and Caroline's attitude toward me, her casual dismissal of people she considered beneath her, wasn't just personal prejudice. It was the worldview of an entire class of people who'd spent generations convincing themselves that their wealth made them better, smarter, more deserving than everyone else. But the detail that made this personal,
The thing that changed my motivation from intellectual curiosity and righteous anger into something much more focused was buried in a document from 1987. Pacific Heritage Holdings had acquired a building in the Tenderloin, a residential hotel that housed low-income families and elderly residents, and within 6 months, they'd evicted everyone through a combination of harassment, rent increases, and building code violations they'd created themselves. The building was then renovated into luxury condos, and the displaced residents scattered across the city or left San Francisco entirely, joining the growing population of people who couldn't afford to live in the place they'd called home. One of those displaced families was named Chen, my family. My grandmother had lived in that building, and when she was forced out at age 73, she moved in with my parents in Modesto, and the stress and disruption contributed to her death 8 months later. I'd been 12 years old, and I'd never understood why we'd lost her so suddenly, why she'd seemed so defeated and broken in those final months. But now I knew. Caroline's family, along with 11 others, had killed my grandmother as surely as if they'd done it with their own hands, and they'd done it for profit while convincing themselves they were improving the neighborhood.
I sat in my penthouse for 3 days after discovering this, not eating much, barely sleeping, just staring at documents and remembering my grandmother's face, the way she'd told stories about San Francisco when I was a kid, how she'd loved that city and felt like it had rejected her, cast her out like garbage when she became inconvenient to people with money and plans. The revenge I'd taken on Caroline suddenly seemed insufficient, too small, too connected to the Morrison scandal. So I created Rachel Park, a corporate attorney specializing in real estate and tax law, with a resume and credentials and references that would pass any background check because I'd built them over 5 years, creating this identity specifically for situations where I needed access to closed networks. Rachel had graduated from Yale Law, worked at prestigious firms in New York and Los Angeles, and was now looking to relocate to San Francisco to be closer to family. She was polished and professional and gave off exactly the kind of conservative, trustworthy energy that wealthy people respond to, someone who understood how their world worked and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. I applied for a position at Blackstone and Reed, the law firm that represented Pacific Heritage Holdings, and within 2 weeks I had an offer. They needed someone with my specific expertise, someone who could navigate the complex tax implications of offshore investment structures, and Rachel Park's credentials were impeccable. I started in January, 6 months after the dinner with the Morrisons, and within the first week I had access to client files, internal communications, and the kind of information that would normally take years to discover. I worked long hours, made myself indispensable, built relationships with the senior partners who managed Pacific Heritage's account, and slowly, methodically, I began copying everything, building a comprehensive archive of 40 years of coordinated displacement and profit-taking disguised as urban development. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The 12 families hadn't just targeted the Tenderloin, they'd systematically identified vulnerable neighborhoods across San Francisco, brought properties through shell companies, then used their political connections to ensure those neighborhoods got developed in ways that maximized their returns while displacing the people who actually lived there. They'd influenced zoning decisions, lobbied for tax breaks, fought against rent control and tenant protections, all while sitting on non-profit boards and donating to charities that supposedly helped the people they were actively harming. The hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scale, and the documentation was meticulous because they'd never imagined anyone would piece it together, never thought they'd need to hide what they were doing from anyone except the general public. Caroline Morrison wasn't even the worst of them. There was William Hartwell, whose family owned the Chronicle, who'd used his newspaper to shape public opinion on development issues while his real estate investments profited from those same developments. There was Jennifer Zhao, a tech investor who sat on the city's planning commission while her family trust owned properties that benefited from her votes. There was Thomas Blackwood, whose grandfather had been mayor in the 1970s and had used his position to lay the groundwork for this entire network. These people had been playing a 40-year game of Monopoly with real people's lives, and they'd been winning because nobody with the resources to challenge them had ever bothered to look at the pattern. I spent 4 months at Blackstone and Reed, being Rachel Park during the day, maintaining my actual company through my phone and laptop at night, letting my life become consumed by this project in a way that probably wasn't healthy but felt necessary. I barely saw my apartment, lived on takeout and coffee, developed an intimate relationship with the law firm's document database, and slowly assembled a case that would be impossible to defend against because it was built entirely from their own records, their own communications, their own admissions of what they'd done. And through it all, I thought about my grandmother, about the building in the Tenderloin where she'd lived until Pacific Heritage Holdings decided her home was worth more empty than occupied. The turning point came in April, when I discovered something that connected back to the Morrisons in a way I hadn't expected. Caroline hadn't just participated in Pacific Heritage Holdings as an investor, she'd been the one who suggested targeting the Mission District for their next major play, the development that I'd already helped destroy. She'd seen it as her chance to prove herself to the network, to show that she could execute the same kind of coordinated displacement and profit-taking that her father's generation had perfected. The Mission Project hadn't been about legacy or urban development or any of the things she'd claimed in her presentations. It had been about proving to 11 other wealthy families that she was as ruthlessly efficient at turning poor people's misery into profit as they were. And when it had failed, when I had exposed her at that community meeting, she hadn't just lost her own project, she'd embarrassed the entire network. Which meant they knew about me now. Not the truth about me, but enough to know that someone had interfered with their plans, someone who understood their tactics and wasn't afraid to fight back. I discovered this in a series of emails between Caroline and Thomas Blackwood, the network's unofficial leader, where they discussed the Maya Rodriguez problem and debated whether they needed to take action against activist groups in the mission. They'd hired investigators, trying to figure out who Maya really was, where she'd come from, whether she represented a larger threat to their operations. So far, they'd come up empty, because I'd built Maya's identity too well. But I knew it was only a matter of time before someone made a connection, before they realized that Maya and Rachel Park and Haley Chen were all the same person. I needed to move faster. I'd been planning to spend a full year building my case, documenting everything, but I couldn't risk them discovering me before I was ready. So I compressed my timeline, worked even longer hours, pulled together everything I had into a comprehensive report that laid out the entire 40-year history of Pacific Heritage Holdings and the 12 families who controlled it.
It was 200 pages of documentation, financial records, emails, internal memos, planning documents, and analysis showing exactly how they displaced over 15,000 people from San Francisco neighborhoods while profiting to the tune of $3 billion. It was airtight, devastating, and career-ending for everyone involved, including several people who currently held positions in city government. But a report wasn't enough. I'd learned that from the Morrison situation, where the recording had been effective because it was visceral and immediate, because people could hear Caroline's voice saying those things and understand in their gut what kind of person she really was. I needed something similar for Pacific Heritage Holdings, something that would make the abstract numbers and displacement statistics feel real and personal. So I did something risky. I reached out to former residents of buildings that Pacific Heritage had acquired and emptied, people who'd been displaced 30, 20, 10 years ago, people who were still angry about what had happened to them, what had been taken from them. I found 40 people willing to tell their stories on camera, including Mrs. Chen's friend who'd lived in that Tenderloin building and remembered my grandmother, remembered how scared and confused she'd been when the eviction notices started, how she'd tried to fight it but didn't have the resources or the knowledge to navigate the system. I created a documentary, professionally produced, 90 minutes long, weaving together the personal stories with the financial documentation and the political connections, showing exactly how Pacific Heritage Holdings had operated for 40 years and who had profited from that operation. I included footage of the 12 families at charity galas and nonprofit events talking about their commitment to San Francisco and its communities, juxtaposed with documents showing that those same families were actively destroying those communities for profit. And I included the recording of Caroline Morrison from that dinner because it perfectly captured the attitude that enabled all of this, the casual conviction that some people deserved to be displaced because they weren't from the right background or didn't have the right resources. Then I did something that would probably get Rachel Park fired and might get Haley Chen sued, but would absolutely guarantee that people paid attention. I leaked the documentary and the full report simultaneously to 3 places: the San Francisco Chronicle, the activist coalition in the Mission that I'd worked with as Maya Rodriguez, and the FBI's white-collar crime division, because some of what Pacific Heritage had done crossed the line from ethically abhorrent into actually illegal, specifically regarding political contributions and coordination that violated campaign finance laws. I released everything at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, then went into Blackstone and Reed like it was a normal day, sat at my desk as Rachel Park, and waited for the bomb to explode. It took 2 hours. The Chronicle ran the story online first, a comprehensive investigation into Pacific Heritage Holdings and the 12 families, with links to the documentary and key documents from the report. By 10 a.m., every news outlet in the Bay Area was covering it, and by noon it had gone national, because it was exactly the kind of story that captured what was happening in cities across America: wealthy people profiting from displacement and gentrification while claiming to care about communities. The documentary was being shared thousands of times per hour, and people were watching my grandmother's friend describe how Pacific Heritage had forced her out of her home, how she'd lost her entire community, how she'd watched San Francisco become a place where people like her didn't belong anymore. The law firm went into crisis mode by early afternoon. The senior partners locked themselves in conference rooms, making urgent calls to Pacific Heritage Holdings, trying to understand how their clients' confidential information had been leaked and by whom. I sat at my desk, doing routine work, acting like I had no idea what was happening, but internally I was watching everything unfold with satisfaction. The FBI announced by 3 p.m. that they were opening an investigation into the campaign finance allegations. The mayor's office issued a statement saying they took the accusations seriously and would be conducting their own review of city planning decisions involving Pacific Heritage properties. And all 12 families were suddenly under intense scrutiny, their names trending on social media, their philanthropic reputations shredded in real time as people realized that their charitable donations were funded by displacing vulnerable people. Caroline Morrison called a press conference that evening. I watched it on my laptop in my office at the law firm, alone because everyone else had gone home early, the whole place feeling like a sinking ship. She stood in front of her house in Presidio Terrace, Douglas next to her, both of them looking older and more exhausted than I'd ever seen them, and she read a prepared statement about how Morrison Properties had always operated ethically, how they were cooperating fully with all investigations, how any allegations of wrongdoing were based on misunderstandings of complex financial arrangements. But her voice shook, and her eyes kept darting to the side, and everyone watching could tell she was lying. The reporters shouted questions at her about Pacific Heritage Holdings, about the documentary, about the families she'd been working with, and she refused to answer any of them, just retreated back into her house while cameras kept rolling.
I didn't feel triumphant watching her fall apart. I felt something more complicated, a mix of satisfaction and sadness and anger that it had taken this much, that simply exposing what they'd done wasn't enough, that I'd had to become 3 different people and spend a year of my life pulling apart their carefully constructed world before anyone would listen. But I also felt like I'd done something that mattered, something that went beyond personal revenge, something that might actually change how things worked in San Francisco, even if just a little bit. The next morning, I went into Blackstone and Reed for what I knew would be the last time as Rachel Park. The senior partners called me into a conference room at 9 a.m., and I could see in their faces that they'd figured it out, that someone had connected the dots between when I'd started working there and when Pacific Heritage's documents had started appearing in the report. "Miss Park," Thomas Morrison said, and his voice was cold with rage, "we have reason to believe you were the source of the leak regarding our client Pacific Heritage Holdings. We're going to need you to surrender your access credentials and leave the building immediately. We're also consulting with our attorneys about potential criminal charges for theft of confidential information." I stood up, took the access badge off my blazer, and placed it on the table. "I think you'll find that everything I released was obtained legally," I said, my voice calm, "and that reporting illegal activity isn't itself illegal, even if the information comes from attorney-client files, but you're welcome to try. I suspect the FBI will be very interested in how much your firm knew about Pacific Heritage's campaign finance violations." I looked at each of them, these men who'd spent their careers helping wealthy people structure deals that hurt communities, and I felt nothing but contempt. "You're all accessories. Every document I released shows how this firm helped Pacific Heritage Holdings evade scrutiny and maximize profits from displacement. So if you want to come after me, go ahead, but understand that I've kept copies of everything, and I'd be happy to provide more documentation to investigators about your firm's role in all of this."
Thomas Morrison's face went red, but he didn't say anything else, just gestured toward the door. I walked out of that conference room, through the office where people were staring at me with a mix of horror and fascination, and out into the San Francisco morning. I was unemployed as Rachel Park, exposed as someone who'd infiltrated a major law firm and stolen confidential files, and I absolutely did not care. Because by the end of that day, 3 of the 12 families had issued public apologies and pledged to donate significant funds to affordable housing initiatives. Because the city council had called an emergency session to discuss new oversight for development projects. Because people were talking about displacement and gentrification and who actually benefited from urban development in ways they hadn't been before. And because Caroline Morrison had called Peter and told him she wanted to meet with me to apologize, to try to make things right, which meant she was finally broken enough to admit she'd been wrong. I didn't respond to Caroline's request immediately. I let her wait 3 days, the same amount of time I'd made Peter wait after the dinner, and then I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a coffee shop in the Sunset where neither of us had history. She showed up looking diminished, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, no makeup, her expensive bob now showing gray roots, and when she sat down across from me, she didn't try to perform confidence or control. "I don't know where to start," she said, and her voice was small, nothing like the smooth authority she'd had at that dinner. "Peter told me everything, about your company, about your grandmother, about why you did all of this, and I've been trying to understand how I became someone who would offer a stranger money to disappear from my son's life, how I participated in something that destroyed people's homes and lives, and I don't have a good answer, except that I was raised to think that money and success were the same thing as worth, and I never questioned that until you forced me to." I looked at her across the table, this woman who'd tried to buy me off, who'd told me I should leave San Francisco because I didn't belong, and I tried to decide if her contrition was genuine or just another performance. "Your grandmother's friend," Caroline continued, "Mrs. Chen,
I watched her in the documentary talk about losing her home, and I realized that every person Pacific Heritage Holdings displaced was someone's grandmother or daughter or friend, and we'd treated them all like obstacles instead of human beings. I can't undo that. I can't bring back the communities we destroyed or give people back the years they lost. But I want to try to do something, to use whatever influence I have left to push for real affordable housing, real tenant protections, the things we should have been supporting all along instead of fighting against them. "That's a nice speech," I said, and I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "But you're only saying this because you got caught, because I exposed you and destroyed your reputation and made it impossible for you to keep operating the way you had been. If I'd just taken your money that night and disappeared, you'd still be displacing people and convincing yourself it was for their own good." Caroline nodded, and there were tears in her eyes now, real ones, not the practiced emotion she'd shown at that dinner. "You're right. I was perfectly happy with who I was until you held up a mirror and forced me to see myself clearly. I don't know if that makes my change of heart worth anything, but I'm telling you it's real. I'm horrified by what I've done, by who I've been, and I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to repair some of the damage." I believed her, which surprised me, because I'd gone into that meeting expecting her to try to manipulate me one more time, to offer me money or threaten me or beg me to stop releasing information about Pacific Heritage Holdings. But instead, she just sat there, looking broken and honest, in a way that wealthy people rarely allow themselves to be. And I realized that my revenge had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It had actually changed her. Not just her public image or her business dealings, but the way she saw herself and her place in the world. "What happened to the other 11 families?" I asked, and Caroline sighed. "Most of them are fighting the investigations, hiring expensive lawyers, trying to minimize the damage to their reputations. William Hartwell retired from the Chronicle's board. Jennifer Zhao resigned from the Planning Commission. A few of them have reached out to me, wanting to coordinate a response, but I told them I'm done with Pacific Heritage Holdings, done with that entire network. Douglas thinks I'm being too dramatic, that this will all blow over eventually, but I can't go back to pretending that what we did was acceptable just because it was legal." We talked for another hour, and by the end, I believed that Caroline's remorse was genuine, that she was actually going to try to make amends, though I also knew that nothing she did would fully repair the harm she'd caused over decades. But people are complicated, and revenge isn't about destroying someone completely. It's about forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions and hoping they learn something from it. Caroline had learned, even if it had taken total humiliation and the collapse of her life's work to get her there. "What about you?" she asked as we were getting ready to leave. "What happens to Haley Chen now that everyone knows who you are, what you did?" I thought about that. "I go back to running my company," I said. "I keep doing what I've always done, which is finding vulnerabilities in systems and exposing them. Maybe I'll make a habit of going after people like you, families who think their wealth makes them immune to accountability. There's no shortage of targets." Caroline smiled sadly. "I suppose we deserve that." She stood up, gathered her things, and looked at me one more time. "I know you don't forgive me, and I'm not asking you to, but I want you to know that your grandmother's friend, Mrs. Chen, I've reached out to her, and I've offered to help her however I can, to make sure she has everything she needs for the rest of her life. It won't bring your grandmother back, but maybe it's something." She walked away after that, and I sat alone at the coffee shop for a while, processing everything that had happened over the past year. I'd started dating Peter as an experiment in understanding human nature, and I'd ended up dismantling a network of wealthy families who'd been profiting from displacement for 40 years. I'd lost Peter, though that relationship had never been real to begin with, but I'd gained something more valuable: proof that the system could be challenged, that even the most powerful people could be held accountable if someone was willing to do the work. The FBI investigation eventually led to indictments for 3 of the Pacific Heritage Holdings families, including Thomas Blackwood, for campaign finance violations and bribery of city officials.
The civil suits filed by former residents of displaced buildings resulted in a settlement fund of $50 million, which wasn't nearly enough to compensate for what had been taken from them, but was more than any of them had expected to see. San Francisco passed new tenant protection laws and increased oversight of development projects, changes that wouldn't have happened without the documentary and the pressure that came from public exposure of Pacific Heritage Holdings. Caroline Morrison quietly divested from all her real estate holdings and started working with nonprofit housing advocates, using her expertise and connections to push for the things she'd once fought against. Douglas left her 6 months later, unable to accept her transformation from the woman he'd married, and I had no sympathy for him whatsoever. As for me, I went back to my penthouse and my company and my actual life, but I also kept building identities and infiltrating networks and documenting the systems that allowed wealthy people to harm vulnerable communities without consequences. I created a website where I published investigations into powerful families across the country, always carefully sourced, always legally obtained, always devastating. I became someone that rich people feared, a cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate the poor girl from Modesto who's actually smarter and richer and more determined than you'll ever be. And every time I published a new investigation, every time I watched another powerful person's carefully constructed image collapse under the weight of their own documented cruelty, I thought about my grandmother and the building in the Tenderloin where she'd lived until Pacific Heritage Holdings decided her home was worth more empty than occupied. Peter reached out to me one more time, about a year after everything had fallen apart. He sent me an email saying he understood now why I'd done what I'd done, that he was sorry for his family's role in my grandmother's displacement, and that he hoped I'd found some peace in my revenge. I didn't respond because there was nothing to say, because Peter had always been incidental to the real story, a key that opened a door to something much larger than either of us. What I'd learned from the entire experience wasn't about love or relationships or even revenge in the traditional sense. It was about power and accountability and the moral rot that happens when people have enough money to insulate themselves from the consequences of their actions. The Morrisons had thought they could buy their way out of my relationship with their son, and in doing so, they'd revealed not just their own character, but the character of an entire system, a network of families who'd been playing God with people's lives for 40 years and had never faced a reckoning until someone finally forced them to. The final piece of justice came 2 years after that dinner in Presidio Terrace. Morrison Properties declared bankruptcy, unable to survive the combination of lost developments, legal fees, and reputational damage. The company was dissolved, and its remaining assets were sold off to pay settlements to former tenants who'd been displaced by their aggressive tactics. Caroline's family legacy, built over a century of San Francisco real estate dealings, ended not with triumph, but with accountability, and there was a poetry to that I appreciated. She continued her work with housing advocates, and from what I heard, she was actually effective at it, using her insider knowledge of development tactics to help communities fight back against displacement. Whether that redeemed her or not wasn't for me to decide, but it was at least an attempt at making amends, which was more than most powerful people ever bothered with. I never told anyone except my accountant about the toll that year had taken on me, how becoming 3 different people simultaneously had left me unsure sometimes of who I actually was underneath all the identities. I spent 6 months after the documentary release barely working, just existing in my penthouse, trying to remember what it felt like to be Hailey Chen without a mission or a target or a role to play. I went to therapy for the first time in my life, worked through complicated feelings about revenge and justice, and whether what I'd done had been worth the personal cost. Eventually, I concluded that it had been, that destroying the Morrisons and Pacific Heritage Holdings had mattered more than my own comfort or mental health.
But I also learned that I couldn't keep operating that way, couldn't keep sacrificing myself to expose powerful people, or I'd end up as damaged as they were. So I scaled back, focused on my company, made money legitimately instead of through elaborate schemes to infiltrate and expose. But I also kept a file of potential targets, families and individuals who reminded me of the Morrisons, who used their wealth to harm others while maintaining respectable facades.
And occasionally, when I found one whose actions particularly offended me, I'd create a new identity, do the research, build the case, and watch their world collapse in real time. It became my hobby, my version of what other wealthy people did with their money and free time. Except instead of collecting art or funding vanity projects, I collected evidence of powerful people's crimes and published it for the world to see. The moral of this story, if there is one, isn't that revenge is good or noble or even healthy. It's that accountability matters, that people with power and wealth don't police themselves, and that sometimes it takes someone willing to operate outside normal channels to force them to confront what they've done. The Morrisons thought they could buy their way through life, thought their money gave them the right to rearrange reality to suit their preferences, and they were wrong. Not because money doesn't confer power, but because there are still people who refuse to be bought, who value truth and justice more than comfort and wealth, who are willing to burn down their own lives if necessary to expose the systems that hurt vulnerable people. I think about that envelope sometimes, the $25,000 Caroline slid across the table at that dinner, and I realize it was the most expensive mistake she ever made. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it revealed about her character, about how she saw me and people like me, about the casual cruelty that enabled everything Pacific Heritage Holdings had done for 40 years. That envelope wasn't just an insult or an attempted bribe. It was evidence of a worldview that needed to be dismantled, and I'd spent a year of my life doing exactly that. Whether it made the world better or just satisfied my own need for justice is something I'm still figuring out, but I know that my grandmother would have been proud, that she would have loved seeing the people who destroyed her home face consequences, that she would have understood why I'd done what I'd done, even if nobody else did. So I continue living in my penthouse overlooking San Francisco, running my company, making more money than I can spend, and occasionally destroying powerful people who remind me why I started doing this in the first place. It's not a conventional life, and it's probably not a healthy one, but it's mine, built on my own terms, and nobody can take that away from me no matter how much money they slide across a dinner table. The Morrisons learned that lesson the hard way, and I've made it my mission to teach it to others who need to hear it, one investigation at a time, until people with power understand that accountability isn't optional, that wealth doesn't grant immunity from consequences, and that sometimes the poor girl from the Central Valley they tried to buy off is actually the most dangerous person they've ever met.